Hello everyone. Today I'm going to show you a crash that happened in the opening at the Chess World Cup. It's quite rare for players rated around 2700 to get caught in the opening in under 20 moves. But here there's a real fight and it's very interesting. White starts with d4. So the Grandmaster with white is named Wojtaszek and he's facing the Russian Grandmaster Fedoseev, who has black and plays e6. c4 is played, then b6, and this opening with b6 and e6 is quite rare, but it's rather flexible and contains quite a few traps. By the way, I made a video with Marc-Andrea Moretzi, who is the youngest French Grandmaster and currently the French champion, where he discusses this opening with e6 b6 because he has played it several times. So since white isn't prevented, they play e4 and establish the center of pawns with 3 pawns in a row. Bishop b7 is played, attacking the pawn on e4, and the bishop is also eyeing the g2 pawn through the position. So white plays bishop d3 to defend the pawn de4. And now, what do black play? There are two popular moves. The immediate f5 push, as will be played in the game, or developing the bishop to b4. And actually bishop to b4 is the most correct move and the one most often played by champions. And after this move, bishop b4 check, it's interesting to note that the best defensive move isn't knight c3, nor knight d2, nor bishop d2, but rather king f1. And in the end, the bishop has no more work to do here. It's going to be pushed back. It no longer has a target. The pawn center will then allow for attacks to be launched against the black king, so we keep all the pieces in order to be able to start this attack. And indeed, the king protects the g2 pawn and thus neutralizes the bishop's pressure on that pawn. And later, white can develop with knight to f3, g3, king to g2, and even rook to a1 once the bishop has been pushed back, for example with the a3 pawn push. But in the game, as I told you, it wasn't bishop to b4 that was played. It was the immediate f5. This move is not as good, but it's not so easy to refute, as we will see. Les Blanc captures on f5. So it's true that they open the diagonal and lose the pawn g2, but they're going to take advantage of the open white diagonal to counterattack the black king. And so after bishop takes g2, queen h5 check. So what are Lenois going to do? Either they move the king to a7, but then bishop g5 could arrive. Black could respond with king f6. So the best move is queen g5. That attacks the king. And afterwards, we can pick up the bishop. So after queen h5, black plays g6. Capture on g6, threatening the push to group of 7 with the attack from the queen. And the pawn will be able to capture the rook by promoting to a new queen. That's why black can't take the white rook. And black plays bishop g7 to mechanically block the pawn's advance to g7. But if the pawn can't advance to g7, it can still capture on h7 to deliver this check. The king moves to f8, and now how do we continue? The rook on h1 can't be saved, but we could take the knight by promoting the pawn to a queen and attacking the king. For example, pawn takes, that's check, king takes. But in this position, white isn't so well off because the queen is under attack, and in any case the bishop will recapture the rook. That's why the Polish Grandmaster decides not to take the knight for now. He plays bishop to g5, attacking the queen. But then the knight comes to f6. The a7 pawn couldn't capture the knight, but it's going to seriously hinder black. And it will muzzle the h8 rook, which can't get into the game. Queen to h4. Black takes the rook and wins a piece. They are up a rook. But they're going to face insecurity around their king. Look, knight to e2 is played, with the idea of coming to f4, then to g6. And this arrival on g6 will be explosive. The king doesn't have many squares left after all. Black plays knight c6. And here it's interesting because the Polish Grandmaster is going to make a mistake. He won't play the most accurate move. But it was very hard to see. He will play knight c3 to prepare for queenside castling, which seems natural, but in reality, knight d2 was better. Why? Because after knight c3, black responds with e5. So white does queenside castling, attacking the bishop, and black takes on d4. And obviously, if the knight had been on d2, the knight c3 wouldn't have been hanging. In this position, the knight c3 is hanging, but white still takes the bishop. After taking on c3, white doesn't waste a move capturing the pawn on c3. They keep attacking the black king. Knight to f4. And you see, we're at move 15 in this position. And look at how wild the position is. It's quite rare to see a Grandmaster game where the position is so blown open after just 15 moves. There are pieces scattered all over the board, and both kings are quite vulnerable. Here the black king is actually weaker, especially with the knight on g6, so black plays knight to e5, counter-attacking the bishop. But in reality, the best move for white would have been to go to e4, taking advantage of the pinned knight on f6 to attack the rook, but above all to control the f3 square. That's very important. Because after bishop c2, the best move would have been to play knight f3 precisely. And even though the knight on e5 controlled the g6 square, knight f3 would have been the best move, the move that the Russian Grandmaster did not play. Instead, he played king f7. But look, knight f3 attacks both the queen and the bishop. And it controls the e1 square. That's important. Because after knight g6 check, the king can come to e8, without white being able to take advantage of the e1 square. And the queen is still under attack. So it could come to f4, and there could be an exchange here. And now rook takes h7. And after rook e1 check, come to f7. And in this position, black still has an extra rook. And the computer considers that black can hold this position. But as I told you, knight f3 was not played. Black anticipates this knight coming to g6, so they play king f7. But knight to h5, attacking the bishop, attacking the knight multiple times. Knight f3 now, queen f4, knight takes bishop, queen takes with the threat of capturing the bishop. And here black makes a mistake. By the way, what would you play here as black? It's interesting. You can pause the video to try to find the move you would play here. So, what did you think of? The best move, not the one played by black, is to play knight takes knight. To accept queen takes with check. Now it's true that the king doesn't have many squares. He can try to go back to f8, queen f3. You can't block with the queen because it also attacks the rook. So there's a check, probably bishop f6. And the computer considers that the position is advantageous for white, even though black has an extra rook, certainly because the king is still very exposed in this position, but it's really not easy to take advantage of it. For example, you could play rook to d1, and after the capture with check, play king to b1, and now the threat is rook takes d7. Because if queen takes, there would be queen takes f6 check, capturing the h8 rook, then taking the a8 rook. You might say black can simply play d6, and maybe now rook to e1, trying to come to e6 to attack the bishop. Afterwards, these are rather complex computer variations, but the computer considers that white is better in this position. But as I told you, black is not going to take the knight. They will play queen retreat, protecting the bishop that is under attack. And here, bishop g6 check provokes the resignation of black. Let's see why. But look, it's quite unusual that in about 20 moves we end up with so much concentration of force and pieces in such a small space. You see, in a very small area, we have almost all the pieces on the chessboard. It's still pretty impressive. So why did the Grandmaster with black resigns? On bishop g6, let's imagine it comes to e7, we could continue with rook e1 check. If the king goes to d8, then rook e8, the knight is pinned. If the queen takes, we win the queen. But not only that, because the knight can't take back. So it's going to be the king or the rook. But then we can take the bishop, then the knight will be hanging, and the h7 pawn is still a considerable asset for white in this position. So after rook e1 check, if the king doesn't go to d8, he has to come to d6. Queen e5 check, king c6, bishop f4 check. And this position will lead to a very quick mate. For example, the knight can't take the bishop, otherwise queen to d5 is mate. The pawn protects the queen and the queen attacks diagonally, vertically and horizontally. So after bishop e4 check, black can try d5. But here, we can play knight takes knight and then take on d5. It's always the same. Black can't take the bishop because of queen to d5, which is still mate. So what did you think of this opening that led to such a battle? In 20 moves, we see that Grandmasters, no matter how well prepared they are, can fall into very complicated, very rich lines and produce very lively games like this one. You can leave me comments, give a thumbs up, share the video, and of course support the channel. Goodbye everyone.